Hello, everyone. This is an audio recording of some excerpts I found interesting from the book Peasant Revolution in Ethiopia, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, 1975 to 1991. I'm Adrian, and welcome to the channel. My interest in Ethiopia, this is John Young writing, the author. Specifically, the northern province of Tigray developed during the course of my tenure as a journalist for the Sudan Times between 1986 and 1989 in Khartoum, a city which hosted many thousands of Eritrean, Tigrayan, and other Ethiopian refugees and their political organizations. Editorially, the Sudan Times had strong sympathies for the peoples of southern Sudan, and I closely followed the revolt of the Sudan People's Liberation Movement, SPLM, which, like the revolt of the Eritrean People's Liberation Front and Tigray People's Liberation Front, EPLF and TPLF, was for national self-determination and opposed by a hegemonic state. However, while these movements shared conditions of national oppression and resistance, they were in many ways very different. The contrast between the political, administrative, and military skills, the level of commitment, and the close relationship between peasants and revolutionaries achieved by the EPLF and TPLF contrasted the confusion, division, and ethnic conflicts that plagued the SPLM. My first introduction to Tigray in April 1988 provided ample evidence of the TPLF's skills, commitment, and ties to the peasants. The journey from the sweltering plains of Sudan to the cool highlands of Tigray was over a road built at the height of the 1984-5 famine through the mobilization of some 100,000 peasants. Organization and dedication to the revolution were evident everywhere I was to go during my 2-week stay in the province. In the relief distributions, formation of local administrations of towns captured only a month earlier, repairs to medical clinics, domestic water supplies, and electrical generators destroyed by retreating government troops, and in the prisoner of war camps, recently enlarged by the capture of thousands of Derg soldiers. But if this all too brief visit served to confirm TPLF claims as to the extent of their liberated territories and their capacity to wage war against the Ethiopian government, and was at least suggestive of the front's support among the peasants of Tigray, it nonetheless raised more questions than it answered. What conditions produced this revolutionary upheaval? How was the TPLF able to acquire and retain such peasant loyalty? What was the background to the Tigrayan demand for national self-determination? What was the relationship of the TPLF to the EPLF? And crucially, how were the largely youthful fighters of the TPLF and their young leaders who inhabited one of the most destitute lands in Africa able to challenge and soon defeat the most powerful army in Black Africa? In 1989, I was forced to leave the Sudan only weeks before the military coup that overthrew the government of Sadiq al-Mahdi, but my interest in the Tigrayan revolution had taken firm hold, and these questions were to serve as a starting point for this research. I would also leave Africa with the conviction that the TPLF and its recently established Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, EPRDF, would, as its adherents claimed, soon capture power in Addis Ababa. However, I would soon discover that while journalists had used much ink writing about Ethiopian famines, they had remarkably little value to say about the Tigrayan revolution. Conversely, The scholarly writing about Ethiopia was concerned almost exclusively with developments at the center, or to a lesser extent with the Eritrean Revolution. The research for this study began in 1990, and the fieldwork took place over a 9-month period in 1992 to 3, and after revisions was extended and updated as a result of investigations carried out in Ethiopia over 4 months in 1995 to 6. Trying to develop an understanding of the Tigrayan revolution has proved more difficult than I first imagined, and as a result, the analyses developed and conclusions drawn from this study are not as unequivocal as I would have desired. However, if this study serves to stimulate debate and encourages further research into the Tigrayan revolution and the remarkable movement which led it, dominated efforts to overthrow the Derg, and was critical to the formation of the post-military government, then my efforts will be warranted. Background to research. Ethiopia has a long history of literacy, but the documents and materials bequeathed to contemporary researchers suffer from a number of drawbacks. First, apart from the published memoirs of a handful of Western travelers, the recorders of history until this century were almost exclusively officials of the Ethiopian court and the church, and this is reflected in both their interests and biases. The history and struggles of the various peasantries who inhabited the Ethiopian highlands barely figure in such reports. Secondly, historical writing on Ethiopia concentrated on the central state, and according to Trilzi, most Ethiopian history was political or diplomatic, and since this took place at the center, most Ethiopian history was the history of the political center and its institutions. Research of the periphery has been seriously underrepresented. This neglect was also encouraged by a number of widely held and erroneous beliefs. First, that Ethiopia had existed as a continuing political entity since the founding of the Aksumite kingdom almost 2,000 years ago. Secondly, that the vast expansion of the country in the final years of the 19th century did not so much represent imperial aggrandizement, but a return to historical boundaries of the past. And lastly, that although many nations and nationalities exist within Ethiopia, they were not bound to the state because of its power over them, but because they shared common elements in their culture. Such notions have long been part of the dominant ideology in the country, but they have been given their most sophisticated expression in the work of the anthropologist Donald Levine in his book Greater Ethiopia, The Evolution of a Multi-Ethnic Society. Levine holds that as a result of generations of war, conquest, trade, and religious proselytization, the various peoples of Ethiopia have evolved into a single societal system. Although widely accepted, Levine's thesis has not been immune from criticism. Analysts have argued that a critical distinction must be made between Abyssinia, which is a geographical area that roughly embraced the northern highland provinces of Tigray, Gondar, Gojam, Wag, Lasta, northern Shoa, and much of highland Eritrea, which generally shared a common polity, social structure, system of land tenure, culture, and religion, and the modern state of Ethiopia, which largely took form as a result of military conquests in the last quarter of the 19th century of mostly non-Semitic, non-Orthodox, and frequently lowland peoples. The historian Gebru Tareke has argued that Levine's desire to assert an Ethiopian nationhood within a unitary culture has only been accomplished by de-emphasizing the ethnic, linguistic, and religious plurality of the society. Another critic, Markakis, maintains that Ethiopian nation-building did not end with the hegemony achieved by the Amhara elite from Shoa at the end of the last century. Rather, this development merely set the stage for the nationalist and anti-feudal struggles that have characterized this century. However, the most serious challenge to Levine's thesis has not come from scholarly critics, but from the emergence of a host of national liberation movements that emerged in the wake of the 1974 insurrection. Ethiopia has a long history of revolts led by nobles from the periphery, and they were either overcome by the center, produced long periods of turmoil, or led to the establishment of a new regime which maintained the old state. But the assumption of power by the EPLF and the birth of an independent Eritrea and the establishment of the TPLF-led government in Addis Ababa, with its commitment to grant the country's ethnic communities the right to self-determination, encourages a rethinking of prevailing conceptions of Ethiopian history. It has also opened the door to new understanding of the central state and its relations with the nations and nationalities of the periphery. The author goes on to summarize some important sources for understanding the revolution which he is interested in. I will skip to the media and the war section. Ethiopia's wars and famines attracted considerable media attention, but the quality of the reporting has generally been poor and as a result has not been widely used in this study. Part of the problem lay in the centrist focus of the journalists. With its pleasant climate, good facilities, and the opportunity to fly out to a site of interest and file a story the same day, Addis Ababa was the location of choice for correspondence. Since it was virtually impossible to cross battle lines to the north from government positions, the Eritrean and Tigrayan fronts could only be reached by taking an arduous and lengthy journey that began in Sudan. As a result, reporting from behind the liberation movement's lines was largely neglected. The difficulties involved in getting to Tigray, as I can confirm from my own visit to the province as a journalist, were considerable. First, approval had to be acquired through TPLF or REST offices in Europe or North America, after which visas needed to be obtained from Sudan, not always an easy task. Khartoum had few of the amenities of Addis Ababa, a trying climate, and even more bureaucratic obstacles, including the necessity of acquiring internal travel visas. When these difficulties were overcome, the TPLF arranged the day-long transport to the TPLF REST Center in Gedaref in eastern Sudan. From there, visitors hitched rides on relief convoys that spent a further night en route to the Ethiopian border. A difficult night journey to avoid MIGs took visitors from the Sudanese plains to the Ethiopian highlands and on to the western Tigray TPLF base of Djenne. It was only then, only at night, and only when vehicles were available that visitors could be taken to various locations around Tigray. In these circumstances, it was almost impossible for journalists to get in and out of Tigray in much less than 10 days, and as a result, few of them, particularly those from large media organizations, reported from the Tigrayan side of the combat zones. These same obstacles also hindered on-site scholarly studies in Tigray. In spite of similar problems in Eritrea, that war was much more widely reported and analyzed by academics than its counterpart in Tigray. Unlike the EPLF, which moved quickly to conducting a largely conventional war with fixed positions and secure liberated territories that were more accessible to non-combatants, the TPLF emphasized mobility and remained preeminently a guerrilla movement until the final stages of the war. Furthermore, the Eritrean movements made a greater effort to encourage journalists to visit their liberated territories, and when they did so, they demonstrated greater skills in dealing with them. Contrary to the EPLF, few members of the TPLF leadership had lived or studied abroad before 1974, and apart from the Sudan, they rarely left Tigray during the course of the revolution. As a result, the front's leadership was very inward-looking, its international public relations poorly developed, and it tended to be wary of allowing journalists and other foreigners to visit territories under their control. While the Eritrean Revolution has been called the unknown war because of the limited media coverage given to it, this description is far more apt of the revolution in Tigray. When journalists did visit the war zones in Eritrea and Tigray, they were usually accompanied by liberation movement armed guards to ensure their personal safety, but this also identified them with these movements, and therefore the information they obtained was less than ideally independent. A further difficulty, particularly in the early years of the war, was that many of the correspondents were closely associated with either the TPLF or EPLF and their aid agencies, and thus open to charges of bias. Nonetheless, according to Duval, whether sympathetic or unsympathetic to the front in question, none of these journalists who visited Eritrea or Tigray has complained of lack of access to the civilian population, or that those interviewed in the field were influenced by the presence of front officials who usually selected them. Additionally, media reporting suffered from political bias and opportunist considerations. Basil noted that articles which presented the TPLF's administration in a favorable light were difficult to publish in the mainstream German press, when key reporters and editors were opposed to the front. It was also feared that publishing such articles might antagonize the Addis Ababa government and make future visits to the country difficult or impossible. This kind of self-censorship, however, was not unique to Germany or the media. Many scholars, aid officials, and foreign government representatives refused to speak publicly about their knowledge of conditions in the liberated territories or of Derg atrocities for the fear that the government would refuse them visas, contracts, or other benefits. The biggest problem with media reporting on Tigray, however, was limited interest in the province and a focus almost exclusively devoted to the problem of famine and the role of Western governments and NGOs in helping famine victims. This focus meant that there was virtually no analysis of the Ethiopian politics, which fueled the violent conflict and caused or exacerbated the famines that engulfed the region during the 1970s and 1980s. Then he discusses the methods of how he conducts the interviews, skipping the methodology section. Chapter Outline. Chapter 1 critically examines the work of a number of influential theorists who take up the issue of peasant-based revolutions in the contemporary era. Chapter 2 has the task of examining the historical background to revolution in Tigray. It provides a historical overview from the founding of the Aksumite kingdom, which is now Tigray, in the first millennium BC, and continues through the province's decline as economic and political power shifted south. In the last century, this process corresponded with the rise of the Amhara-dominated province of Shoa, the establishment of the modern state of Ethiopia under the hegemony of Shoa's feudal class, and its pursuit of policies of modernization and state centralization furthered Tigray's marginalization. The chapter ends with a brief sketch of the collapse of the regime, which pays particular heed to the Ethiopian student movement, both because of its significance in undermining the authority of the old regime, and also because it gave birth to the TPLF. Chapter 3 is mainly concerned with analyzing social and political conditions in Tigray on the eve of the 1975 revolt. While the province's rural economy faced a crisis of rising population and declining access to land, there was little indication that peasants were prepared to mount a sustained revolt or indeed could successfully challenge the state without outside leadership and support. Conversely, nationalist elements among the Tigrayan urban petite bourgeoisie, notably students and teachers, were becoming increasingly drawn to political dissent. And with the collapse of the old regime, they began making plans to launch a rural-based insurrection. Significantly, at the time the revolt was officially launched on 18th February 1975, the TPLF had virtually no committed support from Tigrayan peasants. The next three chapters examine the revolutionary struggle of the TPLF over the 16-year period from 1975 to 1991. Chapter 4 considers the period 1975 to 78 and the central themes of the period, the TPLF's efforts to establish a presence in the province, resolution of conflicts over nationalism, and crucially overcoming its nobility-led and Marxist rivals to achieve opposition ascendancy in Tigray. Chapter 5 covers the period 1978 to 1985 and focuses on the problems of mobilizing peasants, developing a social and administrative infrastructure in liberated territories, advancing the war against the government, and confronting the challenge posed by the famine of 1984. Chapter 6 examines internal leadership struggles, the capture of most of the province's towns in 1988, the expulsion of the military from Tigray in 1989, and briefly summarizes the military and political developments in the lead-up to the Derg's final defeat in May 1991. Chapter 7 is specifically concerned with the TPLF's relationship to the peasants of Tigray. The TPLF's principal objective during the 16-year period examined in this study was to steadily increase its capacity to wage war against the Derg, but this was always conditional upon gaining and keeping the support of the peasants. The principal means by which this was achieved was the TPLF's program of reforms, but reforms also produced social tensions, and this chapter examines these reforms and demonstrates the importance of the front's skills in balancing peasant demands, mobilizing the population, and ensuring the social solidarity necessary to conduct a revolutionary war. The concluding chapter begins with an examination of some of the problems faced by Tigray in the transitional period, and then turns to a consideration of a few of the key issues that must be confronted by the TPLF and which will speak to the character of society Tigray will become. This is followed by an overview of political developments at the center between the fall of the Derg in 1991 and the formation of the post-transitional EPRDF government in May 1995. In particular, it briefly examines the EPRDF's efforts to establish an ethnic-based federal system of administration in Ethiopia, which, it is argued, follows directly from the Tigrayan struggle for national self-determination. And that's the end of the introduction to peasant revolution in Ethiopia. Thanks for listening.